Welcome to E Squared Emporium for all things AP Psychology. Today we're going to talk about the studies connected to operant conditioning. So important studies like B.F. Skinner and his pigeons. So instrumental learning is another way of saying operant conditioning, and we really give credit to B.F. Skinner for much of what was done with behaviorism. He was known as a radical behaviorist because he believed every problem could be solved through behaviorism. And he was quite prominent through the 60s, 70s, 80s. You can see he passed away in the 90s. So Skinner studied how to influence an animal's response by controlling the consequences of the response. So again, we're dealing with reinforcement and punishment. And again, this type of conditioning is important for voluntary behaviors. You're going to decide to do the behavior because you want the reward or you don't want the punishment. And he thought that this was a better way to explain our behavior than classical conditioning. So let's talk about some of his pigeon studies. He would deprive the pigeons of food for 24 hours, which makes them very hungry and much more willing participants. If you're hungry, you're more willing to play the game. So the hungry birds would get food by pecking at a dish or pecking at a spot. This is called a Skinner box. So they would find whatever the target was they were supposed to peck at. And only by doing that would they be rewarded with food. And so by all of these little activities, he taught pigeons to lie. The bird at the bottom is lying about the color. So even though the bird would know that the correct answer was either yellow, blue, red, or green, the bird actually learned that if they lied, they got the reward of food. So he taught pigeons to lie. He taught them to be superstitious. We'll talk about how he did that. He taught them to dance. He taught them to play ping pong. Again, just using food as the reward, as the reinforcer. So the superstition comes in. He would wait 1 minute before giving the birds food. And during that 1 minute, the pigeons would do what we call the dance of the 10,000 hops. They would come up with all kinds of moves, swiveling their head, turning in circles, hopping on one leg, kind of like how we look when we do TikTok dances, all just waiting for that reward. And then the pigeon thought that they had to do all of that entire thing every single time in order to get the food. Because it worked the first time, they did it a second time, it worked again. They did it a third time, it worked again. So now the pigeon thinks all those moves are needed, when really it was just a timer. It was just a timer being set for 1 minute. So in this way, Skinner actually taught the pigeons to be superstitious and to have rituals. And just like people have rituals, people with OCD have to flicker the lights 3 times before they can enter a room. People with superstitions have to wear their lucky socks. So the pigeons developed the same kind of behavior. And here he is again with his pigeons. So one of the strangest projects was the Pigeon Guided Missile Project. So coming out of World War II, the U.S. Navy had needed a weapon effective against the German battleships, and the early guidance systems had been bulky and very ineffective. So they had Skinner working on his pigeons to see if he could create a better design, and he actually did. He divided the nose cone for the front of a missile into 3 compartments, and he would put one of his pigeons into each compartment, and each compartment had a video image of what was in front of them, like a map of where they were going, and the pigeons would peck towards the object that they were supposed to aim for, and they were actually directing the missile. So eventually it was abandoned, even though they had demonstrated that it was very reliable, that missiles led by pigeons were actually hitting the mark. But very few people were going to trust the guidance system led by pigeons. And there are some definite humane issues here, some ethical issues here. You're basically asking the pigeons to die. It's a suicide mission. It's a kamikaze mission for the pigeons, that they're going to lead the missile all the way to the target without realizing that they're going to lose their life when they hit the target. So there definitely are some ethics there. He used this operative device that he created called the operant conditioning chamber. We call it the Skinner box. So it's a research tool where he could put a mouse or a rat or a pigeon inside this cage or box, and there was a food dish, a pellet dispenser. He could use lights, he could use sound, he could use shock, he could use all kinds of different things, and try all different types of trials. So you can see from these pictures the electric grid, the food, the shock generator, the levers, the lights, all the different things that he could then teach the pigeons and the mice and rat in his Skinner box. Now, he also supposedly, rumors have it, tried to create an air crib, a very controversial form of childcare in the 50s and 60s. But he said it was going to be easy to clean, no mess, didn't have to keep chasing your toddler around the house and cleaning up diapers. It was humidity controlled. So it was supposed to assist in the raising of babies, to literally put a baby in a Skinner box, in an air crib. And he apparently used it on his own daughter, Deborah. There are several controversial things written out there about his air crib. So this is B.F. Skinner's chart, basically, of how to get animals to behave. And he didn't think that punishment worked well at all. He said with punishment, there was really no learning that was happening. That reinforcement, reward, really led to learning much faster. So there's a situation, there's behavior, there's a consequence, and if you take the reward side, learning is happening. If you take the punishment side, it's no learning is happening or very little learning is happening. So he was much more on the reward side. And you can think about it in terms of people. We just learn how to avoid punishment the next time, right? If you have your cell phone taken, you just wait it out, and then next time you just learn to avoid that punishment. You learn to be sneakier, or you learn to hide it better. So that's really all you've learned. You haven't actually learned how to live without your cell phone. You've just learned how to not be punished. So again, he was able to find superstitious behavior in the pigeon, and that translates, of course, to superstitious behavior in the human. So any behavior that is accidentally reinforced makes us believe that there isn't a link. We create an association there. So if you repeatedly perform this action, then it's going to make us feel that this is meant to happen, right? Every time you see a black cat, then something happens. Every time it's Friday the 13th, it's a really bad day. There's actually no relationship between the behavior or the event and the consequence. But we have this, we call it an illusory correlation. We talked about this in Unit 0. Like you wear your lucky socks for the soccer match, and your team always wins when you wear your lucky socks. And you use your lucky pen when you have an essay to write, and you always get a good grade. It's a correlation that really doesn't have any connection, but we saw that the pigeons can believe in this and do their dance of the 10,000 hops, and people can do their own dance of 10,000 hops too when we get superstitious about things. Learned helplessness is another study in operant conditioning, kind of a sad study. Martin Seligman, 1967, also created a box with shocks on the floor, and the dogs were subjected to uncontrollable electric shocks. And he would shock them at different times and shock them randomly and shock them without any warning. And what he found is that when there was no way to escape the shocks, when there was no way to get away from the shocks, the dogs eventually gave up. They would cower in the corner, and they would give up all hope, and they would become quite depressed. So it is being forced into feeling helpless, and it does create surrender and depression. And it does relate to humans. His study, as sad as it is, we do see that this does translate to humans. The dogs who were subjected to the shocks were not able to learn simple tasks. When he would try to do a different behavior with them, they had given up. They couldn't learn even the simplest of things because fear blocks the brain from learning. So anytime we go through abuse or trauma, we talked about the ACEs scale, anytime we go through that, it blocks learning in the brain. So we know that children cannot learn when they are in fear or when they are being abused. It shuts down the learning part of the brain. So Seligman believes that this explains depression in people and depression in animals, like animals who are in zoos. Some of the animals that are at SeaWorld, they've been having issues with their orcas at SeaWorld, and they believe it's from depression. So uncontrollable events are going to happen in our lives. There's going to be death of people that we love. There's going to be natural disasters that we can't control. There's going to be war in areas of the world and poverty, and people do go through unemployment, divorce, abuse. Terrible things do happen. But when we feel helpless to those is when we become depressed and we have what's called learned helplessness. And we're going to look at some studies where students can feel learned helplessness. If school has always been a challenge for you, you may eventually get to that point where you believe you're helpless and then you give up and then you stop trying. So we see this with women who have been abused. People say, well, why don't you leave? How come you can't get away? They have learned helplessness. They don't even think they could survive escaping. They don't even think they could get out the front door. Children who are abused, prisoners of war. If you're captured during wartime and you're being held, you at a certain point, you don't even try to escape because you don't believe you can escape successfully. It impacts our self-esteem, it impacts our self-worth, and it is a form of depression. So moving on to reinforcement schedules. There are really two types, continuous and partial. And then there's several types of partial we'll get to in just a minute, but let's focus on continuous for just a second. Continuous reinforcement is where every single time the person or the animal hits the target, they are instantly reinforced with that half-second to 3-second rule. This is the quickest way to train a new behavior, but it's also easily extinguishable. It goes extinct real easy because we can't be there all the time to see the behavior. Think about how many times your dog sits at home when you're not there to reward him for sitting, right? It's hours, it's 8, 9 hours a day that we don't see our dog sitting. So that's why it's easy to extinguish because the dog is like, man, I've been sitting all day and no one has brought me a treat. I have not been rewarded once, right? The picture here of this kid who's pulling the t-shirt over his head, the teacher isn't going to catch that every single time he does it. So he's going to get away with it sometimes. So continuous reinforcement is great, but it's really hard to be that consistent that every single time something happens, you are there to reward it every single time. And that's hard. So we go into partial reinforcement, which is what most of our life is set up with, partial reinforcement. So we have fixed ratio and variable ratio. Now, ratio means amount. So fixed ratio means there's a fixed number before you get the reward or the reinforcement. This is a very high rate of responding. So for instance, every 10 that you buy, you get one free. Every 5 times you go to Subway, you get one free. Every 10 times you go to Starbucks, you get one free. In a video game, every 100 coins you gather is an extra life. So it's 1, 2, 3 reward, 1, 2, 3 reward. Variable ratio amount means we don't know. We don't know what the amount is before we're going to get rewarded or be a winner. So this is very consistent rate of response. It gets us very easily addicted. Gamblers are very addicted to this variable ratio. It's also very resistant to extinction. It's really, really hard to kind of have this be extinct. So it makes for a more interesting video game too. So if you don't know how many lotto tickets you have to win until you actually get the winning lotto ticket, right? A gambler never knows which hand it's going to be the winning hand, or if you're playing the slot machine, you never know which time it's going to be. So fixed interval is time. So there's fixed interval, variable interval. All right, so the first target response after a fixed interval of time has passed is reinforced. What that means is you're going to be reinforced after 5 minutes, or you're going to be reinforced after 10 seconds, or you're going to be reinforced once a week. So this is the only one that produces what we call scalloping. It's the scalloped shape of the line. We'll look at the lines in just a minute on a chart. For instance, making toast, you must wait a fixed amount of time before you're reinforced with the toast. Hospitals now use this. If you're going to self-administer pain medication, you have to wait a fixed amount of time from the last dose before you can get the next dose. That's fixed interval. All right, so let's say you get paid at your job every Friday. That's fixed interval. Okay, it's nice to know when you're going to get paid. Variable interval would be you don't know. You don't know the amount of time. What if you never know when you're going to get paid? It could be 3 months. It could be 2 days. You just keep going to your job and you never know when they're going to get you a paycheck. It's variable. So after taking a test, maybe students have to wait a variable amount of time before they can check their grade, and you never quite know how much that time is. You have to wait a variable amount of time before checking your cell phone for a new text message because they might come in sporadically. You never quite know. So variable interval is a little bit trickier. Just you just have to kind of wait it out and go, is it time now? Is it time now? Is it time now? Like what if our recipes never told us how long to bake a cake? What if they just said, oh, I don't know, guess, right? That would be variable interval. Well, I don't know. One time it took me 5 minutes and the next time it took me 25 minutes. It's variable interval. But that's not the way it is, right? Baking a cake is a fixed interval. It tells us after 20 minutes, check the cake, it will be ready to come out. So this is what it looks like. There's the scalloping that I talked about. So we have fixed interval on this chart and fixed ratio on this chart. So fixed ratio, like every sixth behavior. Fixed interval is a set time every 5 minutes. And then we've got variable interval. So I don't know, maybe 3 minutes, maybe two, maybe four. And variable ratio, I don't know, maybe three behaviors, maybe five, maybe it averages out. Okay, and again, this is all of those put together, and you can see the different schedules of reinforcement. So applications of operant conditioning, how do we use this in the real world, and who cares about operant conditioning these days? Well, it's used for education all the time. Teachers use pop quizzes to get you to, be nervous and be prepared and be ready for class, giving you, extra credit or bonus points. All of that is positive reinforcement. It's used for training animals. That's training circus animals and livestock and zoo animals, and even to teach your animals to go to the vet. All of that takes shaping. It's used for behavior modification in a ton of different types of psychology. So it can be used for phobias, it can be used for OCD behavior, it can be used for depression, anxiety. It's used in elementary schools and daycares as a token economy. In return for completing chores, you get tokens, or you get so many stars at school and then you get a token. And it's used for behavioral therapy for all kinds of psychological disorders, including eating disorders. And now you are ready for class.